Hi, I'm Rob Wilson, and I am a professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Alberta, and I'm the director of the Living Archives on Eugenics in Western Canada project. Yeah, the Sexual Sterilization Act of Alberta followed a whole series of similar pieces of legislation, largely in the United States, beginning in 1907, that authorized sterilization on eugenic grounds of so-called mental defectives. And it was in place in Alberta for well over 40 years, as you know, and repealed only in 1972, which made it a little bit unusual amongst North American jurisdictions, one of only two jurisdictions in Canada, the other being British Columbia, to affect that kind of legislation. The repeal, I think, was very significant, perhaps not unexpected, given some of the other things going on at the time in terms of greater awareness of mental health and mental illness issues about human rights, disability rights around the time. But I think it was a very welcome kind of change in Alberta. In terms of Albertans knowing about the Sexual Sterilization Act, I didn't grow up in Alberta, as you may be able to tell from my funny accent. But I have lived here for a dozen years, and I didn't know anything about it, even though I'd worked in the area and often taught university courses on eugenics, mainly focused on the United States. Until I arrived, and when I arrived, I found out very directly about this because there were several students in one of the classes I was teaching who had relatives who were sterilized under the Sexual Sterilization Act. And that was in the middle of my teaching this material without any awareness of that, and that was a very rapid change in how I went about doing that. And then I found out that my own home department was fairly centrally involved because the founding chair of the department was the chairman of the board, of the eugenics board, John McCachran. He was also the longest serving provost in the university, and there had been a whole movement within the university, spearheaded in the philosophy department to some extent, to re-examine that history, and it involved removing McCachran's name from prizes, rooms, and so on. And it just happened just before I arrived. So that was really the first time that I found out about it. But apart from that direct experience of that students had who were connected very directly to that history, in general, I found that students don't know much about it at all, and I suspect they're fairly typical of the population. In fact, they may know more about it in general than people, and that's somewhat surprising. Yeah, that's a hard one. That's one of those sort of counterfactual, tricky questions. I mean, it may well have been that sterilization would have continued on. It was continuing on at a fairly high rate at that time, which again was unusual in North American jurisdictions, provinces and states. But with some of the other changes, maybe people would have realized that, hang on, this isn't how we treat people any longer. And it would have sort of, in some sense, dropped off. Though I wouldn't have been that hopeful. I mean, it's quite surprising that the legislation wasn't just on the books for as long as it was, but it was actually actively enforced, and that didn't happen in other places. And there's a good question about why that happened in Alberta. So it may well have continued on, and that would have been, I think, nothing short of horrific. Well, you might optimistically think it's just that people didn't know about what was happening. That there was a kind of almost willful ignorance, perhaps, on the part of people in the general population, people in positions of authority, because once it became clear through Leilani Muir's court case and the other cases that were settled out of court, that whatever you think about this kind of legislation in and of itself, how it was actually enacted and how the policy was enforced and so on, just departed massively from even the legislation itself, with almost complete disregard for the fully human status of the people who were appearing before the eugenics board, who were meant to be properly examined, because it's a very serious thing to interfere with somebody's body in the way that was authorized in the Sexual Sterilization Act, and they recognized that at the time in 1928 when they set up a eugenics board, because why would you bother to set up a board that was to check that you sterilized only people who really needed to be sterilized, in some sense of needed to be sterilized, right? But then it turns out the board really didn't do its job, and that's very, very troubling. Yeah, I can say a few things about the trial. Again, I wasn't here. It's somewhat secondhand, but I do know a lot of people now who were expert witnesses in that case, or provided expert witness reports in other cases. So I have some sort of unusual secondhand knowledge of the case, and of course I've spent quite a bit of time talking with Leilani about her own impressions and some other people who were present. I think that the case received a lot of publicity at the time, and it immediately raised to public awareness an issue with a long history that people, I think, were shocked by at the time. And it led to some rapid sorts of changes, at least in terms of the dialogue that was going on and the attention that was drawn to how we think about people with developmental disabilities, what kind of labeling can happen, what happens when governments are negligent in exercising the responsibility they have to care for their citizens. And I would say that lasted for maybe a couple of years, but then again, just a few years later, as from my teaching experience, first time I taught around this and I found out about the issue around 2001, it was right at the forefront of students' minds, at least some of them. 2 years later, I don't think a single student had even heard of this again, and so it disappeared fairly quickly. So I think the case, in terms of its public impact, I mean, there's a lesson in that. It's a bit of a sort of news story that's got a bit more of an extensive reach. But there's something more to be done in terms of making people aware now, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, about this relatively recent history. So there's an interesting question as to why Leilani Muir was able to win her case. She was the first person to successfully bring a lawsuit against the province for wrongful confinement and sterilization. As anybody who's interacted with Leilani knows, for all intents and purposes, there is nothing wrong with Leilani. There is no way she should have been in this kind of institution. There's no way, having been in the institution for the number of years that she was, that she should have been authorized for sterilization in a machine-like sort of way that was common at the provincial training school at the time. And so she had, you know, if you're like a normal person, at least as normal as I am, if that's normal at all, or you, before, you know, appearing to have been treated in this way, that real, you know, and people are saying, well, hang on, that shouldn't have happened to her. Then I think that's going to make it all the more glaring, the kind of treatment that she went through and its inappropriateness. But the interesting question that's raised by this, and I think in something you just said, is if there was somebody who were more visibly disabled or had a more apparent developmental disability, could they have succeeded in this sort of law case as well? I think is an interesting question and something to speculate about. Certainly, I think that certain aspects of the case might have been harder to prove. So, for example, that the sterilization was wrongful in many cases, I think would have likely to have been sustained even for people who had more substantial developmental disabilities or were apparently more visibly disabled. It might have been harder to make the case of wrongful confinement, because in that case you say, well, yeah, they met the criteria for being admitted and being housed in an institution like this, which clearly Leilani didn't. And it's because people didn't bother to do IQ tests, because people didn't bother to do the appropriate follow-ups that were mandated as part of either the Sexual Sterilization Act or the associated policies, that you could have somebody housed in a place like this for a key part of their life, which substantially changes what's available to them for the rest of their lives. Not just the fact you've taken away the possibility that they could have their own family, which in Leilani's case mattered massively, But it matters to many people whether they have developmental disabilities or not, exactly that kind of issue. But there's also questions about the educational standards in institutions like that, where people regularly reported getting somewhere between a grade 5 and grade 7 education. What are the downstream consequences of that? Again, independent of the particular abilities or disabilities that you have. Is it possible that this kind of legislation could arise again? I guess I've got two sorts of answers. There are practices now, there are contemporary practices of eugenic sterilization. For example, in Australia right now there's a big commission, a parliamentary commission, that's investigating the, if you like, extra legal sterilization of teenage girls, especially with disabilities, by doctors, and there are hundreds of cases, and this is happening now. This has happened in the last 10 years. In other parts of the world, you have reported sterilization of native populations. In South America, for example, so in terms of explicit sorts of policies, practices, and legislation, there's actually much more eugenic sterilization going on than you might have expected. But second part of the answer is a lot of what was done more explicitly in the explicit eugenic era is being done implicitly. I think in terms of a continuation of attitudes of subhumanization towards people with disabilities, a sort of suspicion that there's a way in which people with developmental disabilities or other kinds of visible disabilities a drain on society and are propagating their own kind and need to be sort of treated in a special sort of way. And I think it comes out through, or with an interaction with attitudes towards babies, infants, and fetuses, either with disabilities or with characteristics that are diagnostic of a potential or likely disability down the track, in terms of the medical attention that they receive, in terms of the attitudes that parents have towards the results of screening tests that they undergo through pregnancy, prenatal screening, pre-implantation, genetic diagnosis, and so on. So Down syndrome is one of the best known cases, trisomy 21, and the policies associated with that. Both the formal policies and then the informal attitudes of parents, doctors, and others in healthcare professions that underpin or mediate between the technologies themselves, if you like, in the abstract, and the actual decisions that people make at the end of the day. So I think these things are very much alive now, and for many people they would fall under the heading of eugenics, under a new sort of vein, so-called newgenics. So it's an interesting question, I think, about whether some form of explicit ban or through legislation or social policy is likely to be enacted that prohibits people from having children with certain sorts of characteristics, and that the idea being that as we have greater technological sophistication in our diagnostic capacities, whether that informs these kinds of policies. It's hard to see that. I mean, you may well have, I would expect there to be policies that make it, that are differential with respect to, if you like, the kinds of children that you choose to have, so that more financial burden may fall on parents explicitly through legislation if they go ahead and decide, for example, to have a child who's likely to have Down syndrome because they've been passed through a screen test for trisomy 21. Whether that could lead to a complete ban in somewhere like Canada, I think it's difficult to see that from my point of view, but I'm more concerned about the more informal, behind-the-scenes ways in which those decisions get made, and they're already being made. The vast majority, over 90% of fetuses that screen for trisomy 21 are aborted willingly through willful choice, informed choice, though perhaps sometimes misinformed choice of parents. There are very strong interactions between the availability of certain kinds of results and the outcomes, the desire to avoid disability, even when, as is actually the case with trisomy 21 screens, the fact that you get a sort of positive result there still makes it massively unlikely that you'll have a child who has Down syndrome, just more likely than if you'd gotten a negative result, but still in the single percentage figures there. And it still leads people, therefore the overwhelming number of fetuses that are aborted, even with positive screens, are so-called healthy fetuses. So it tells you something about either how uninformed people are or how strongly they feel about the avoidance of any kind of disability, because it also doesn't tell you, if you like, how severe the case would be. And that's true, that would be true of other sorts of results as we get more and more genetic information about particular individual fetuses and even young children as well, and interventions in their lives or in some cases deaths. I think it's an important history, even if a difficult history, to teach in schools. And it's important partly because if it's not taught, there's an important part of the social past that is just sort of missing in terms of, if you like, the self-image that students have of Canadian society and who's been included and what kinds of equality we have and what kinds of opportunities there are. The fact that, if you like, relatively small numbers of people are institutionalized or were institutionalized and were sterilized is somewhat irrelevant, in my view, given what we know about the functioning of the Eugenics Board and the practice of eugenics in the past. We know that many hundreds of people, likely thousands of people, were under any criterion wrongfully confined and sterilized under that legislation. And that should give pause, because we had a system of checks and balances in place to prevent that very outcome. And it went on for a long time. Why? What other kinds of things are we doing now that might be like that, and we might see as being like that in 20 years? Unless we start to interrogate the past, it's much more difficult to envisage these issues in the present and in the future, especially as we get to express our, if you like, cultural technophilia and love every new piece of technology that comes along that will give us more information. We need to think about the uses of that kind of information and the decisions that it feeds, because for some people it's literally a matter of life and death. For others, it's a matter of whether they could have a family or not, whether they get a full education or not. And making mistakes here is pretty costly. And it would be good if students coming out of high school, say years 10, 11, 12, had some appropriate knowledge of this kind of history, even if it involves them grappling with a difficult past and coming to reflect on that and think about that. So I think it would need to be handled sensitively and in an appropriate sort of manner. And it's all the more, there's a stronger need for it by the fact that there's almost nothing out there now in social studies curricula, in biology 10, 20, 30, in the Alberta curriculum. So it'd be good to see some change in that in the near future. How does the awareness of our history impact the future? I think that if you're aware of the history and you recognize what happened to, if you like, certain kinds of people or certain putative, alleged kinds of people, and you have no reaction, that perhaps there's something sad about you as a person. You've got to be affected by, and I think have your decisions informed by, that knowledge of that past. Exactly what difference that makes to anyone's decisions, that's up to them. And that's something I think that each individual needs to determine by themselves or in groups and through reflection and so on. But certainly being informed, I think, is a starting point. And at the moment, we have a relative paucity of information about this past, in the same way that until recently we've had a dearth of information about the residential schools history, which also there's a kind of parallel history there, where it's a difficult episode to come to grasp with in terms of what happened to people who were deemed to be inferior in a certain sort of way and were treated perhaps with good intentions in some ways, but in a very dehumanizing and culturally destructive manner. And I think knowing about that kind of history, just as knowing about the history of people with disabilities or deemed to have certain kinds of disabilities, especially so-called mental defectiveness or feeble-mindedness, also should give us food for thought about our contemporary attitudes in society's social practices. So you sometimes hear this talk of getting rid of certain kinds of problem people. You heard this in the eugenic era, the explicit eugenic era, where there was the idea of getting rid of paupers or getting rid of people who contaminated the gene pool in various sorts of ways. You know, they might be alcoholics, or they might be prostitutes, or they might have tuberculosis. That was a condition that came up in a number of pieces of eugenic legislation. And in the future, could we expect there to be something like that, where there's certain types of people? You certainly hear about the elimination of Down syndrome, and people taking pride in that, in the same way that you might eliminate a certain kind of contagious disease through vaccination programs. So I don't think it's just a mere possibility in the future. I think it's actually happening, and I think there's a debate that we need, or a discussion that we need to have as a society about that, and about human diversity. Yeah, I mean, the question you ask about what sort of animal I would be if I could be any animal, that's a good one, actually. Mm-hmm. I mean, I thought the answer would be obvious and probably not even need asking, but I guess it does.
Yeah.
Wombat.
Didn't I say?